Another object type along with array, well, is an actual object. Arrays which we just looked at contain multiple values, and will reference a single value inside of the array by accessing the index number, which is the position beginning from 0. We briefly looked at objects earlier, and these are also a collection of values. However, an object value is referenced by a key. Over to our start files and into the introduction to objects. We're going to begin by creating an object. So let's say let user, and set this equal to our curly braces. Remember from earlier that we can add a series of properties, which is a key and value pair. We have a key, and for example, our user may have a first name, and we can set this equal to a string. So we have the key, and we have the value, and it's this key which we use to access any of these values inside of here. Separated by comma. Let's add a little bit more detail, the second name. We can place in as many of these as we would like to, such as the occupation, web developer. For this example, we'll add a boolean value of logged in, set this to be true. Finally, we can also add some foods inside of here, and this can also contain nested arrays too. So just like a regular array, we'll open up the square brackets, and we can add inside of here as many values as we would like to. Okay, so now if we save this, and you'll notice here we have the level 1 heading, we access this heading, and we're going to set this equal to our user object. So replace this string of text with the user variable, save this file, and refresh this inside the browser. So as soon as we do this, we see the value of object. And this is what happens when we try to display the full object inside the browser rather than an individual property. It converts all of this object into a string. An object is the default value which is displayed inside the browser. With arrays, we use the square brackets to access the value's index number, but for objects, we instead use the square brackets to access each one of these keys. So instead of displaying the full user, open up the square brackets, and then inside, we access the property name inside of the string just like this. So this is going to reference our user's first name, and if we save this and refresh, this has now been replaced with the value. We can change this to be anything else, such as the occupation. Save this, and this also works perfectly fine too. Another way we can do this to achieve exactly the same thing is to also use the dot notation. So this is called the bracket notation because we're using the square brackets, but the dot notation is also a way to access any one of these properties too. So we can say user.first, and this works perfectly fine too. During development, if we did also want to access the full object and see all of the available properties inside, we can make use of a console log, passing our user object, and rather than displaying object like we're seeing inside the browser, if we were to go over to the browser and open up the developer tools, inside of the console, we'll see the full value of this object once we click on this arrow just here. We can also expand any other object types inside, such as this array, and see all of the contents nested inside there too. So these console logs can be useful for debugging and generally checking what values are contained for any data type. And also, as well as this console log, if we wanted to see this structured inside of a table format, we can change this to be a console.table. Now we can save and refresh, and this will then display our object in a table-like fashion, which may be a little bit easier to understand all of the data which we have inside of an object. These console logs can be useful for debugging and generally checking what values are contained for any data type. If we had multiple objects, we can also place them inside of arrays too. So this will be useful for storing lots of users or products. So instead of having this object here, we could change this into an array, and then this would allow us to store multiple objects. So our first one, and since this is an array, we separate each value with a comma, and then each one of these objects we can add as many properties inside as we would like to. So sticking with the same thing, we could add in the first name, and then separated by a comma, the last name, just copy the details from this one, paste this into our second object, and we can change the names. And of course, now we have multiple users. We could also change this to be users. So if this was a real life application and we were to make a database call for a list of all of our users, our data may come back like this. But now we have multiple objects inside of this array. Can you work out how to access both of these first names? Well, remember that since arrays are indexed, we can access each object by the position inside of the array. So this first one is index position 0, and this second one is index number 1. So what we need to do is we can remove this. This is now called users. Open up these square brackets and we can access our first user with position 0. Remember from before, when we're accessing the full object just like this, it will display object inside the browser. So what we need to do is to access any one of these individual properties by the name of the key. So we have the two keys of first and last. Let's go for the first. Save this and refresh. This is giving us an error since the user is not defined. So let's take a look at the problem. It's just this console table here. We're trying to log out the user, but this has been changed to users. And then reload the browser, and we're now accessing our first name. Let's go for the second object, so position 1. And this is how we access the values contained when we have multiple objects stored inside of an array. Along with users, there are also many other use cases for this kind of setup. For example, if we had an e-commerce store, we could hold a collection of products, and also the shopping basket could be an empty array, and then each time the user adds a new product, that object could be then pushed to this array. So as you can see, there is many use cases for this, and also so much more to discover with objects and arrays too. And we'll go a lot more deeper into these in the upcoming sections.